Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, November 2nd, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 5 and the 23rd webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I am turning the webinar over to Neil now. Neil.
Thank you, Bob. It's a great pleasure once again to be with you and our other colleagues today. We are continuing a very interesting discussion, not just the one that we held the last time, but a whole series, as you have stated. For viewers who have not been following our series, I would recommend very strongly that you download the text that we are going to be discussing today. And that specific text is my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. It is a document that I wrote in June of this year. And you would download it, if you do not have it already, from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any punctuation or hyphen in the middle. Now, in effect, this essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that I wrote in June, is an insertion into my much longer document called Revelation Revealed. Revelation Revealed is the framework for our series of webinars as a whole. That document, Revelation Revealed, is also available on the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, the website that I identified earlier. In practice, we will not really be using that document today. So if you are inclined to concentrate on our proceedings today, then the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, will be sufficient for your purposes. Now, because you do not have any option while you are listening to our program to ask questions spontaneously, we offer you an alternative. You could send us in a question or two by email. If you wanted to do that, you would use the email address that is listed at the bottom of the webpage for the Committee for the Global Endeavor, namely info@globalendeavor.net. Your question should pertain to something that someone says during our discussion today, or possibly ideas of yours that you have while listening to us talk about these topics. If we decide to use your question on the air during some future webinar, we reserve the right to edit it. And in that event, we will, all of us, address your question. You would not get an answer just from me personally. So now, having gone through the procedural aspects of this discussion, I would like to turn to the substance. We are discussing, as of the bottom of page 2 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and in particular, the quotation from paper 103 by Melchizedek that talks about mind and how mind functions in human experience. This quotation begins with the words, "Always must man's inner spirit depend." Andre, would you be prepared to read that quotation, which begins at the bottom of page 2 and continues on to the top of page 3?
I'll be glad to, Neil. Always must man's inner spirit depend for its expression and self-realization upon the mechanism and technique of the mind. Likewise must man's outer experience of material reality be predicated on the mind consciousness of the experiencing personality. Therefore are the spiritual and the material, the inner and the outer, human experience is always correlated with the mind function and conditioned as to their conscious realization by the mind activity. Man experiences matter in his mind. He experiences spiritual reality in the soul, but becomes conscious of this experience in his mind. The intellect is the harmonizer and the ever-present conditioner and qualifier of the sum total of the mortal experience. Both energy things and spirit values are colored by their interpretation through the mind media of consciousness. Melchizedek, paper 103, section 6, paragraph 6.
Thank you, Andre. As many of you recall, we began discussing aspects of this paragraph during our preceding webinar. I would like to talk about the idea of a channel. I would like to get people to comment on this. Specifically, I would identify the first two sentences as creating the presumption of a channel, namely mind being a channel for all experience. In the first sentence, the Melchizedek states that always must man's inner spirit depend for its expression and self-realization upon the mechanism and technique of the mind. In the second sentence, likewise must man's outer experience of material reality be predicated on the mind consciousness of the experiencing personality. Now, to me, in effect, this says that what we do in life, everything that we think of, everything that we experience, everything that we touch is affected by mind. Bob, this is almost self-evident to us now, but why is it so little understood and appreciated in the world at large?
Well, no, I think that we've talked a little bit about this in the last webinar, where modern medicine, modern science, up to and including a few iconoclastic scientists really believe that the mind is the brain, and that may be an outgrowth of our secular totalitarianism. It may be an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, certainly in the West. It may not be as so strong in the East. And as we get into this idea that you have a little further on in the paper about Occidentalization, I'll talk a little bit more about what I think is the difference between some of that thinking. But I think to answer your question, clearly for me, it's that basic science and philosophy at this point considers the mind the brain. Now, there's we brought this up in the last webinar, is that there are a few iconoclastic. I guess that's the best term to give them. They're certainly out of the mainstream. They're not conventional thinking, such as Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who are kind of and part of the reason that I believe that he came up with his idea of morphic resonance, and the fact that the brain is a tuner, that it's tuning into these fields that he calls morphology. For he started in biology with thorns and has actually gone beyond that. Part of the reason is, I think, because he lived in an Indian ashram after he got, or prior to him getting his doctorate. And he brought with him that Eastern experience of ideas of the potential energy, infinite, absolute, and this idea of the Akashic records. And he took that and has modified that pretty much to the degree to which he's sort of and doesn't call this, of course, because he's not familiar with the Urantia book that I can tell. The idea of the adjutant mind spirits that condition all of evolution all the way up until the first two humans, when worship and wisdom, the sixth and seventh, then finally take hold, and humanism then explodes on the planet. So that's a long way to kind of describe why I think we haven't come to that conclusion as a civilization, as a society yet. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I think what you have said helps at least elucidate the difficulty in regard to matter. And as you said, the atmosphere of secular totalitarianism definitely affects this, but it amounts to asserting that matter extends throughout reality, that matter dominates reality. And in effect, those who believe this, who, for example, imagine that ideas originate in some corner of the brain, are neglecting not only mind, but also spirit. Whereas the Melchizedek is telling us that mind is the channel for both. Now, Francois, I'd like to turn the question in a different direction in asking you, why do advocates of spirit, I guess I would have to say traditional religionists, maintaining that their field, effectively spirit, dominates the other two, dominates all of reality, that spirit has nothing to do with mind or matter? How do you analyze that situation?
It's just because it's their business. Just like for the materialism, all is material and it's their business too. But in reality, they both are right in the sense that the mind have to be connected with the matter, but always with the spirit. But you will not have the exclusivity of one or the other. And it's what is written in that paragraph, and I agree with that. But the religious, the traditional religion, they put spirit and all the spirituality in general, very upper matter. It doesn't touch. But in fact, if we see what's happening in the history, it's touching. So they may want that it's not the case, but it's the case. It's all interconnected.
Thank you. I think that you have hit on an important point in the sense that the advocates of traditional religion have pretended or have claimed to be in charge of the entirety of all material and intellectual functions. They have, in effect, asserted that spirit dominates all of this and that they are in charge in spirit, and therefore they are entitled to preach to all human beings that we must follow their instructions. So what I believe we are looking at is the need for an approximate parity, an approximate equality of the three types of human experience that are characteristics of finite reality: matter, mind, and spirit. They are all related to each other, and mind is in the middle, is the channel for our experience of matter, and it is also the channel for our experience of spirit. Doreen, let me put to you the relationship of mind to spiritual experiences. You have talked very eloquently in previous webinars about relating to God and your experience of God directly. Now, without putting you on the spot, is it nevertheless that these direct experiences with God were actually experiences in your mind perceptions, interpreting these spiritual leadings? Does that trouble you for me to say that?
It's very difficult to express how things work for me. To understand, I believe it's in the soul. And yes, you have to interpret through your material mind what the experiences are. But it's an inner knowing. There's so many different ways that the spirit can, could connect with your mind, even during your dream state, your sleep. It said they try to engage, I guess, your mind and all the circuitry, but it comes out in terrible ways, very convoluted and disturbing. But nevertheless, there are times that it can be done. It's not never. The thing is, if you're I think if your mind, well, you talk about harmonized, you know, if the spirit mind and your material mind is harmonized in the personality, it operates pretty smoothly, but it's not always, and it's probably seldom, I would say. But my experiences always were, it was not at my will. It was always at God's will. I never expected things to happen. So your question to me is, how do I interpret it? It comes in many different ways. I could only interpret it, a knowing is in the soul. When you know in your soul, it's not pre-thought of. There are things that just like I wouldn't have known. How did this come into my mind experience? It's there. Now, how did it come there? I had no pre-knowledge of many things. So it's a real difficult question. It comes in many ways. The spirit, of course, has to collaborate, you know, and of course the energy systems. Well, it talks about, you know, the energy systems in the universe. Well, it's all one on the super, you know, universe level, but when it comes down here, it's so divergent, I guess you would say. And it says, even the thought adjuster, it says it takes more than one lifetime to really connect with your mind. It is not a simple thing. And you have to be receptive. And what does that mean? The channel has to be open. So you talk about the channel flowing, the light, the insight. Yeah, it's so complicated just to, you know, give you a few sentences and tell you what something is. For me, it is difficult because it's an experience. And to put into words experiences and how it flows and how I think it's not exact for anyone. And for me, it's not exact every time either. But you have to interpret it, of course, through your material mind. It's just a knowing. I didn't think about it. It just comes to me and that's it. Or I see it and I know it. How does that work?
Well, Doreen, you have confirmed my insight that this is indeed a very, very complex matter. And frankly, in asking you the question, I was pressing you to try to give your understanding. I think the underlying issue is that the circuitry of the mind that interprets these leanings is not the content, but the content that comes through the circuitry has to be affected by the circuitry. That just as electricity has to flow along a path of a wire, then the attributes of the wire affect the transmission of electricity. Now, for example, we are told in some portion of the Urantia book that a seraphim immediately knows how many hairs you have on your head. And the author goes on to say, and you would regard a seraphim as a mathematical prodigy, but the seraphim just has that naturally. So in effect, the author of that passage is describing the characteristics of spirit mind that the seraphim possesses. It is just what a seraphim knows and can know because of the nature of the mind. In the papers that talk about life in the mansion worlds, we are told that we will have additional senses. Right now, human beings have 5 senses, but on the mansion worlds, our number of senses will be increased dramatically. So one could look at that as an expression of the Marantia mind. How many senses are available to be interpreted by the consciousness of the Marantia being, the ascendant mortal? And in our case, we have 5 senses and they operate in a certain way. They operate in making ideas, in making experiences available to us. But it is this availability that we think of as one thing, whereas it actually proceeds via the mind network that is in relation to the human being. And so the problem that we have functionally is that those who have spoken on behalf of spirit have claimed that they dominate everything. And the current crop of secular materialists who speak ostensibly on behalf of matter claim that matter dominates everything. But both sides of this argument are ignoring the fact that the experience of matter and the experience of spirit comes through the mind and is affected by the characteristics of the human mind. So I do not know whether our colleague Andre is available here. He seems to be offline at the moment. So I think we will have to, you have now returned to awareness or consciousness?
I'm here provisionally. I apologize for the real world intruding.
So is the human mind active? I guess so. By your answer, I can infer that it is.
Yes. And I will.
You will demonstrate that by answering my next question. And
yes.
That is to comment on the final two sentences of the paragraph that you read earlier. And I read for repetition. The intellect is the harmonizer and ever-present conditioner and qualifier of the sum total of mortal experience. Both energy things and spirit values are colored by their interpretation through the mind media of consciousness. So
Sure.
In addition to being a channel, the attributes of the mind are affecting the message. Is that what you would agree with, or do you have some other interpretation of these sentences?
Well, your question itself is almost asked and answered.
All right.
Because the fact that I would have an interpretation that would differ from yours would seem to indicate, and I'm sure all of us would have a different interpretation, would indicate that the content of mind alone would be sufficient to color what an interpretation could be as mind tries to coordinate, harmonize these various values and experiences of both the inner and the outer life. So that it must be that we accept, or rather expect, and then accept that interpretations are going to be different for every human being. Now, given the fact that we've had Spanish Inquisitions, we've had all kinds of people stoned to death for their beliefs, this has flown in the face of a true understanding of what the human condition has been throughout history. The fact that we have expected as a species in more primitive civilizations that we should all believe alike, even though the human condition is directly astride that. And so you have all manner of human beings, both in the past and today, having contorted their minds into pretzels in order to present ideas in conformity to ideas which are regarded as either authoritative or the prevailing idea that is accepted, even when they may not believe exactly what that is based on their own experiences and their own kinds of thinking. So that's just to speak of the content of mind. Forget about the fact that the will and the personality makes selections on its own and can actually modify what that mind lets in and what it actually decides to correlate with other things. So that would be a long way around, going around the world to go across the street to say to you, yes, Neil, we have different ideas. We should expect all of our ideas and all of our minds to be different in this process of correlation and harmonization.
Thank you, Andre. I will now draw a conclusion which is self-evident, I think, when you hear it, that thinking is influenced by language. We express our thoughts in words. Words taken together create language along with certain rules for stringing them together in a sentence. But it's still the words that we are expressing, and therefore our ideas are colored by the words. The words are an artifact of mind. The language is an artifact of mind. And now perhaps I will be excused for putting my colleague Francois on the spot by asking him about this, because of course his native language is French, a language which I have studied. But is it your view, Francois, that you sound a bit different when you're speaking English as opposed to the time when you're speaking French?
Yes, it takes more energy to me. but what you said, there's a curious thing that more an experience is complex and intense, and more it's hard to find words to explain, because words are at a certain level, and the experience sometimes is very far that level. So it's hard to find words. But me, in my own experience, since I was a kid, there's a part of my inner experience that I should call the inner observer. It's an observer, and always the same observer. I was 6, and it's the same observer than now at 64. And that observer, I think it's my personality. Now I have words to make a quality on that, to tell what it is, but I think it's my personality, and my personality needs the mind to be conscious of the experience. We may have experience that we're not conscious, but to be conscious, we need the mind, and the tool that the personality uses is the how they call that, the intellect. It's all connected, but it's the observer. Who's that observer? It's got just one channel. So it may be the thought adjuster, it may be a material pain or sorrow or anything, anger or pleasure, but it's always the same channel oriented on the same observer. So always talking at the first person. So even the thought adjuster, he don't speak to me. I say I. It's my experience with my thought and my mind. So it's always my experience, but the influence can come from everywhere.
I'm going to follow up by asking you a question that is a bit playful. Do you have the impression that your thought adjuster speaks French?
I think it's got a universal language.
Okay, all right.
That's but it's beyond words. So there's no need to be French or English or anything. It's beyond words.
Yes, I agree. And I was emphatically asking you a rather playful question, but I think your point is well taken. I would now like to turn back to Doreen, because earlier, although she was not entirely speechless, it was clear that she was struggling for words. And I want to ask her about the relationship between new words and new ideas in expressing these spiritual realities. We are told at some point in the Urantia book, I've forgotten where the passage is, that advances in spiritual experience are partly dependent on advances in words, in language. And so my question to Doreen is whether she believes that as human beings develop a greater ability to express ideas through advanced language will help diminish the distance between spiritual experiences and the words that we are able to use to describe them.
Wow. Now, that maybe I'm a little caught up in a different way of thinking. What language do you use to connect with the spirit? It's a language of love. Is that what you're asking me? How you connect through a different language to connect with higher mind?
Well, Doreen, I'm a little bit less elevated in this particular question. What I'm asking you is the words. You're talking English. And so you're imprisoned by the English language. And to some degree, you cannot go beyond what the English language is able to express. Now, as the English language improves, as more ideas are developed, would you think that succeeding generations would be able to do perhaps a bit better job in describing their spiritual experiences?
In describing them, so you're talking about through material mind. Okay.
Well, yes, we're
Yeah.
talking in words, and the words come out of material mind, and the ideas that we express are an artifact of language.
Sure. But the thing is, there's a lot of words that we use throughout, I would say, maybe, centuries, whatever. And they don't exactly describe the same thing for each of us. The words necessarily are not compatible with the experiences. It's a funny thing. I was speaking to a young man who told me about his near-death experience. And he said to me, there was no language when you're in the presence of the spirit, of that all-encompassing light that's full of love. There is no words to express it. It's absolutely this, it envelops you in everything without words. And it's a knowing, it's an inner. So to express that, yes, he could use whatever language, but you have to have the language of the spirit. And of course, if you're highly involved in spiritual studies or philosophies, yeah, you could probably find better words. I just don't find, because I don't know it. It's hard for me to express something that I haven't experienced. I don't know if people would even understand the simple language I put it in, because I've had that experience, even in my study groups. People look at me like, huh? And it says in the book, that's how you know things, through your own experience. So let the spirit talk to, each spirit thought adjust to talk to the other one. Maybe they speak the same language, of course, and the knowing is, I guess, downstepped into our interior minds. I know I'm not answering your questions because they just don't sit right with me and my understanding how things operate. It's not an intellectual thing. It just isn't when you come to spirit. But through your mind, everything is on the inner world. Everything in this book describes the most important experiences. The most important thing in your life is in the inner world. How do you describe the inner world in English words or French or anything? And when you ask, Francois, about the French, when I told you that other time that it came to me in French from the spirit, well, I didn't know French. So how does that work? And why? So I guess the thought of justice speaks many languages, right? I think it's the tune it's playing, resonates, the vibration of the chords resonate, and that's how they understand the passion, the emotions that we are. It is not flat. So words to me, it doesn't matter. I remember my kids were little, we went to Mexico and they spoke 2 different languages and they knew how to play with each other. They just instinct, they knew what to do. And it was wonderful observing. And I said, no, sometimes you don't need language necessarily to convey life. But those experiences, Neil, I just can't answer you correctly. I'm sorry. This is off my my, my harmony.
Well, Doreen, please allow me to assure you that there is no correct answer. We are talking about insights into matters that are very difficult. In effect, my question pertained to the relationship between inner spiritual experience and the words that we use to describe those experiences. And that's very difficult. It is simply a matter of how the mind operates, for sure. Francois, I believe you motioned that you'd like to add
Wanted
comments.
to react with two things. First of all, the English language has been chosen by the revelators, so it's certainly not the worst to express the concept. And the second thing is that the word, two words that people are craving anywhere around the world and that would change everything are two very simple words. It's father and brotherhood. So, père et fraternité. It's a French or English, but it's very simple. It's not a very hard concept, but it should change everything.
Francois, I agree with you, but I'm going to take the option of the moderator to complicate things a bit. The
Okay.
word father depends on your understanding of who a father is and what he does.
Mhm.
In the old tradition, fathers were very domineering and dictatorial, very cruel, perhaps. So in addition to the word father, we also have to improve, upgrade our concept of a father.
Yes,
Human father
absolutely.
first,
Yes,
and
I agree with that.
and a heavenly father also, because the central thesis of the Christian faith, for example, is that the Father was angry with all human beings, and it took the death of his son on the cross in order to overcome that. So I submit to you that this concept of an angry father is a terrible distortion.
Mhm.
And that human beings must upgrade our own ideas of father
Yeah.
in order to benefit from the spiritual advantage that you've described.
And fathers have a great responsibility to with the word father.
I would agree with you. I'd like to turn slightly in a different direction in order to put the question to Bob. All right, he's motioned. Bob, will you also address the question that I'm going to add to you, but you're of course free to say anything you wish on the
Of course,
previous
of course.
strands.
If you have something in mind, please.
I have something in mind that people in your broad field of computers and computer technology have this disturbing way of inventing rather strange collections of words that sometimes cause me to say, huh, what's that? And so perhaps they amount to the cutting edge of technology interpreted in terms of words. And perhaps they have used words in ways that are meaningful to them, but not to many of the rest of us. So do you look upon this ability to invent new terms and new words in the field of computer programming and computer dynamics as an example of the progression of mind and the growth of vocabulary to express new realities?
Oh, without a doubt. That was a tangential thought, actually, Neil, so I'm glad that you brought it up. I was chatting with my son-in-law last night, and he's much deeper into this business than I can possibly ever be. I'm from a different generation and kind of sort of hanging in there, to say the least, to understand some of these terminologies. Just in the networking business, we've gone from wires to wireless to he threw a term out last night, actually, called near field, and I can't think of the third term right now, but there's a there's Bluetooth, there's all of these words, terms, multiple terms in many cases, that define technologies that are doing multiple functions. So completely agree with that. And I was going to talk about words, something, but gosh, there's a lot in my head here to talk about. I'll try to make this short. This paragraph that you put out here, I still want to make sure that we can relate this back to the true teachings of Jesus. And I think that what the papers have done with this particular paragraph, which is wedged in between two other paragraphs that I wanted to talk about, and I hope I don't forget to do that, is that this is a real jam-packed, process-oriented, highly cosmic conceptual paragraph that sort of led me to worship, to be honest with you. And I said something about that in one of the previous webinars, and I want to bring that back again here. Doreen said something, and I wrote down, I thought was really interesting. The words are not compatible with the experiences. Absolutely. I think of I think it's back in paper 5 where the divine counselor says it's about high time that someone had a sublime experience, a sublime experience that they can't explain in words, to be able to understand what the thought adjuster is actually telling them. I'm a little contrary thinking about that the thought adjuster speaks in different languages, because I don't think the thought adjuster speaks in language that we're familiar with, because this paragraph talks about experiences, which is what worship really tells us. And Neil, you had highlighted this sentence here that says, man experiences matter in his mind. That in itself, we could talk quite a long time about and do some deep research as to what we really are talking about, because not only do we have 5 senses, we have a good possibility that those 5 are broken down into 9 senses and potentially 21 senses if we start taking things like sensing gravity or sensing the Coriolis, etc. There's a lot that's going on in the human down at the subconscious level that there probably are more than 5 senses. And then it goes on to say, this is after the semicolon now, he experiences spiritual reality in the soul, but becomes conscious of this experience in his mind. So just in that one sentence, I think your idea of the mind as a channel is certainly good. It's certainly much more than that. It's as the papers use the term circuit all the time, where it's connecting the superconscious to the conscious, but it's also connecting experience. And if we think about what that paragraph in paper 5, section 3, paragraph 6, which talks about the worship experience, and the process that it talked about or says, I'm going to read that. It says that the mortal mind consents to worship, the immortal soul craves and initiates worship, and the divine adjuster present conducts such worship in behalf of the mortal mind and the evolving immortal soul. So the soul is a mind in itself. In fact, the midwares call it the mid-mind. It's that mind that it's that resurrecting piece along with our personality that then gets a new Marachi identity once we hopefully get to the first, second, or third mansion world. And it's that part that is the arena, as that whole paper talks about, the mind arena of choice, which is where we make our choices. And in fact, if you go back to that idea that the mortal mind consents to worship, that's all that has to happen. And then the experience takes place. And it's a cosmic experience, by the way, because it ends by saying true worship in the last analysis becomes an experience realized on 4 cosmic levels: the intellectual, the martial, the spiritual, and the personal, the consciousness of mind, soul, and spirit, and the unification in personality. There's a lot going on here, and I won't get into the paragraphs that are in front of this and in back of this, because it speaks of how we view either spiritism or materialism. And those two have to be correlated through philosophy, of course, and we don't have the motive to be able to handle that. So back over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to spring from your thought, which was profound, in a slightly different direction. In effect, the thesis that I've been pursuing, not only today, but also in our previous webinar, has to do with the interrelationships among mind, matter, and spirit. And as you have aptly highlighted, the Melchizedek has told us that mind is a channel for experience of matter, and mind, the human mind, is also a channel for the experience of spirit. But what I would like to do now is to turn this to Andre in the sense of whether he is inclined to conclude that the awareness of the the awareness of the operation of mind as a channel may help diminish the arbitrary convictions of advocates of spirit and also the arbitrary convictions of advocates of matter, because it establishes that what they are talking about is something that is interpreted through mind, and they are obliged to use mind in order to talk about these concepts.
I think you make a very good point, Neil. Just through the substance of the question. Once again.
Well, it's not like I'm leading you by the nose, but perhaps I am giving you a question which is pulling you in a certain direction.
Well, it is, but it's astutely pulling us along that way because to me, it is in education that we might resolve the kinds of differences in positional arguments and positional ideas that seem to be absolutes the way they're presented sometimes in human discourse that don't even that completely disallow the ability to even talk about them on some level. That we are seeing, we are currently in the year 2019. I will state that emphatically because it's it's quite obvious in certain quarters with many populist movements coming to the fore, both in America, Britain, Hungary, Poland, Turkey. These places have allowed for a certain polarization of human discourse as though ideas as they're presented are only capable of being seen from one point of view. And it seems to me that the antidote for this is an education that allows for the pulling out or the rising above one's own intellect and being able to say, my intellect is a relativity in all of this. I don't know everything. Neither, even if I did have a large body of knowledge, it's a given that no person's body of knowledge is replete. Every body of knowledge on this planet is incomplete and has to allow for the input of other minds, at least for consideration, at least to the extent that we understand that there's a sincere human discourse occurring. The problem is that so much of human discourse right now, if I can opine for just a moment, so much of human discourse is prevalently insincere, in my opinion. It is positional. It is from a standpoint that is meant to market, for lack of a better term, a particular position in order to persuade others to take hold of that position, whether or not it is true. And we need to move to a more educational stance where people become the arbiters and are recognized as the arbiters of their own thought, and that is recognized as a good for human society. If we were to get to that, we would have considerably less conflict, or at least considerably more tolerance for the kinds of ideas that are presented. But if I may, Neil, I'd like to go back to what you put forward to Francois and with regard to language, because I had a unique sort of experience with that just a few years ago. unbeknownst to Francois, j'ai habité au Québec pour 18 mois. Okay, I lived in Quebec for 18 months in 2012, 2013. And not only that, had the even more unusual experience, and my French was a bas intermédiaire, very low intermediate French when I arrived, but in going to the Cégep at Saint-Jérôme, I improved to an haute intermédiaire at that time, and now it is declined once again to bas intermédiaire. But that's not why I'm speaking about it. The use of language by the thought adjuster, and Bob made some interesting points. Obviously, the thought adjuster is working on levels we cannot even imagine. Okay, what level the thought adjuster might be working on to begin with. At the same time, we also can't imagine to what depths the thought adjuster may be able to descend even into human language. And here's the experience I want to relate just briefly, because I know we have much to cover. But I think it speaks to the question that you put forward to Francois. And it had to do with this idea of, you spoke a little flippantly, do you think that the thought adjuster is speaking to you in French? Well, I would say the thought adjuster is speaking to Francois and to you and to I in whatever language we possess. Okay, whatever tools we have used, that thought adjuster has become adept in using those tools as well. I had the unique experience of being able to participate in the study group of Gaëtan Chalon and Lynn Saint-Pierre in Saint-Sophie. And it was wonderful. They have a wonderful study group that meets Monday nights. Now, why I bring that up is they were studying in French. French is very definitely not even a second, it's a third language for me. And while I was coming up in it, what I began to see as we were studying was that because my knowledge of the Urantia book, after many, many years of study was adequate, let's say, okay, to the task, the thought adjuster was illuminating certain phrases out of the Urantia book in French for me to be able to participate. Now, this was an unusual experience. It was not a perfect experience, but I was able to speak to the concepts that were being talked about a little bit based on the fact, and not necessarily, not in perfect French by any stretch, but I was able to recognize where things were going, and the thought adjuster was managing that process. This is as close to any kind of experience other than when I'm about to make a real big faux pas. This is when I hear the thought adjuster's voice most, because I don't hear it when I'm wanting to just do better. When I'm just looking for an answer. I really only hear it when I'm about to really screw up. And in that one unusual situation where the thought adjuster was clearly using my rudimentary knowledge of French coupled with my knowledge of the book and putting the two together in a creative way I would never have suspected was possible.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting. I would prefer, however, to go back to part of what you said in the earlier part of your contribution about the uses of language for real communication. And the difficulty, of course, as you implied, is that sometimes communication is used as a device for exerting authority or domination over others. And the words that one uses are tactically designed to achieve this kind of authority or this kind of domination. Mm-hmm. So in addition to having mind as the channel, we are obliged to use words, and the methodology of using words can convey a spirit of openness. It can convey a spirit of sincerity, but it can also be used to manipulate. And this is a deep problem that we have as a species of human beings, that the urge to manipulate others for one's own advantage is unfortunately a rather deep trait that is part of the human psychology. And the human psychology, of course, is another way of saying the human mind. So in addition to having limitations that mind imposes on our ability to communicate, we have character defects, character flaws that have their echo in human mind that must likewise be overcome over a period of time in order to reach higher levels of spiritual expression. Have I said anything that sets your teeth on edge, sir?
Not a bit. No.
Not a bit. Thank you. All right. Bob, I would like to go on to the next couple of paragraphs and ask you to read them for us. The paragraphs on page 3 that start at first glance, and we may be tempted. Could you simply read through those 2 paragraphs for us?
Sure, Neil. This is on insert page 89A-3 at the first paragraph. At first glance, this intrinsic entanglement of mind and spirit may seem to be a narrow philosophic point, one that has few implications for our current purposes, but such an impression is essentially an illusion and perhaps even a delusion. To be sure, our planet does not lack for traditional religionists who congratulate themselves that their spiritual impulses and practices are not only entirely independent of all other aspects of human life, but so intrinsically superior as to be exempt from rational analysis and objective comparison. We may be tempted to smile at all that, but the wiser and more productive strategy is to reflect that the true challenge of the religion of personal spiritual experience is to find appropriate methods that will enable us to overcome and transcend the tendencies of inherited culture, the conventions of society, and even the diverse characteristics of language itself, so that we can enhance our receptivity to and respect for true spiritual experience, the realm of human life that can inspire and unify all of God's children, all human beings who share our planet Urantia. In Jesus' second discourse on religion, he explained.
Thank you. That is indeed where I wished you to stop, because we will soon proceed to talk about the rather long quotation. But I would like to ask for Francois's impressions of the second sentence in the first paragraph that Bob read, that there are many traditional religionists who congratulate themselves that their spiritual impulses and practices are independent of other aspects and also superior. Why do these traditional religionists take that view, that their ideas, that their perceptions are superior and not subject to any interpretation or challenge?
It's what they've been taught. So they believe it, and but it's an example of a delusion, because to advance in the psychic circles, you have to advance on the 3 levels, on matter, mind, and spirit. So if someone think that they're just spirit and nothing else, it's a trick of the mind itself that can convince somebody. There's a center on the ego, and but it's a trick. It's not the reality. That's all I can say.
In connecting this to our earlier discussion, that is to say, my discussion with Andre, would you interpret these statements of superiority as a device for exerting authority or creating
Absolutely.
and perhaps domination over others?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it is enough to please the mind, but the control and the authority is an extra. Without that, there's enough to it's good for the people. Oh, I'm right, and I have the truth, and everything like that, and not influenced by the material things. But certainly it's a way to control other people.
Thank you. I would now yield to the temptation of my own to give a slight commercial for our webinar. In effect, we're talking about the difference between uniformity on the one hand, uniformity being a characteristic of this attitude that Francois has been describing very eloquently, and instead our focus on pluralism and diversity. The point that there is not a single answer which is obligatory for everyone. Rather, there are a variety of views. Reality is diffuse, it is diverse. It is perfectly acceptable for a variety of views to be expressed. We are pluralistic in our intention. And so if you have, any of you watched our programs in the past, you find that we disagree among each other, and that is perfectly all right. That is perfectly acceptable. It is this attitude of superiority that Francois and I have been discussing, which implies that there must be a uniformity of views. Bob, would you characterize this difference between uniformity and diversity for us, please?
Well, uniformity and unity are the two terms that the papers use quite frequently, and especially in relation to social aspects. Unity, not uniformity, is the religious watchword that I think more than one revelator has expressed. And uniformity, points direct. We've talked about this probably in 2 or 3 webinars in some different contexts, but the uniformity certainly is I'm not sure which is the cause and effect. Maybe the effect is the cause, but it certainly leads to, as Francois supported the premise, to an authoritative mode of providing passive religion to groups of individuals. One of the things, as I prepared for this webinar, there was a pretty strong indication when I went to Google Books, and I'll mention which ones those are, as we move further down the line here of the webinar, that the development of dogma over time changed quite a bit, because early on, from the from the 1st century to about the 8th century AD, or CE, I guess is what we're using now. The mode of the individual was that they weren't literate, of course. So language was severely stunted, I think we could say, from where we are certainly today, and from where the Renaissance and the Enlightenment started to take humanity. You could see why this group passiveness was easy to commandeer, and those who were in the authoritative state to be able to use the language and to write the documents and the books and political policy as they wanted to were able to drive that authority down to the masses. But pretty much religion was a group aspect, and I suspect that's why the institutionalization of the religious formats in all 3 of the Occident religions or theologies had to happen that way. So in your second sentence, where you say that a better challenge will be to look at the personal spiritual experience, that's the unity that we're looking for, is to really understand that going back to the first sentence about this spiritual experience, where our mind is going to have these sublime experiences, these sublime worship cosmic experiences that are going to be hard to define. We may have to come up with new language, such as the Revelitors had to do for things like abstinate and eventuate, just to mention two of them. So I think that language plays a very big role, in understanding how that language and how it interacts with unity and uniformity in a cyclical way is very important for us also as we move forward, as personal spiritual experience has to intersect and interact with the current institutions that are here and fully alive on the planet today. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I would now like to turn at least to the implications of the second paragraph that you read, Bob. And in doing so, turn to Doreen. Doreen, in the past, you have talked about meeting people on the streets or in the subway or some other gathering and having them turn to you perhaps for a rather confidential type of discussion that might amount to advice, in which you were able to connect with them somehow. And my impression was that this ability of yours to connect with them did not depend upon asserting authority or claiming to be the most knowledgeable person, but rather you were connecting with something perhaps residing on a spiritual level, and that perhaps your experiences in talking with people confirm the idea that the second paragraph pertains to. Would you react to that idea?
Are you talking about the tendencies of inherited culture as well, or it's just relationships, being able to connect with the receptivity and respect for the true spiritual experience? Is that where you're going, Neil?
Well, I'm really looking at the middle of that first sentence. Enable us to overcome and transcend the tendencies,
Okay.
and communicate with people on a deeper level, regardless of their particular convictions or their particular experiences, so as to appeal perhaps to the spiritual inclinations that are part of that.
Yes, thank you. I never connect on a political level or anything that would negate having a connection with someone. It has to be on the soul level. It has to be where you're understanding, you're feeling that they need your help. And I have, in that area, I don't have an ego. I don't care. I really never. I'm most insecure person, probably at many levels, but there it comes very natural to me. And it's almost like a spiritual gravity pull in that direction, that where there's a need, I would be glad, to help someone. And it's hard to talk about things, but there's nothing as far as superior, inferior at all. It doesn't even arise, and people feel really comfortable and thank me. And I get the most benefit, from it. Even where we do the women's retreats, it's just wonderful to listen, to be a listener and let the spirit move them. And I think when you are open and receptive to that energy, it's so natural. It really, it's like you're talking about channels where things flow. There is no motive. Let's put it that way. There's never a motive. I have no intention. It's just, it has to be part of your nature, your personality. It just flows. And there's something beautiful and good in that, because it responds to that person in their soul, and then they're able to open up. So, the tendencies of inherited culture, there's people that are biased, but though that doesn't come up. There's prejudice, there's superstitions, all that other stuff that people inherit. It doesn't come up when you're talking through the spiritual, thought adjuster to thought adjuster, or soul to soul, or because you care. And there is the difference with caring about somebody that is not motivated by anything except allowing them to feel freer to express themselves because they're either in pain or there is, issues. And I said before, it's easier to talk to a stranger, not a problem. Honestly, it always, I think it enhances my life as well, and the receptivity of my thought adjuster, be able to give that without thought. I don't think about it. I know it. And I've experienced many, many things, so I can be of use. It's just the spirit using me. That's all it is. I am just the covering for the spirit. He's using me, that's all. And you know it when you know it. And of course, when you're in your material mind and you think you're an elitist or superior or your language, just what you're all talking about, that to me is where it takes a dive. Then there becomes this idea of you don't know what you're talking about and I know better. And this is so pathetic. It is, what you asked, previously, I think that people are so insecure. They can't think for themselves. They have to duplicate or copy or ape what somebody else tells them because they need to belong. And if you are a true independent soul, you're a person that doesn't have that dependence except on, the inner world, except where the true leadings of the spirit will take you, then you're free to say whatever your heart expresses. And it wouldn't be negative. It really would never, because that's not how the spirit functions in us. It needs to come out in a beautiful way. And that's where we talk about the harmony of language, the harmony of the spirit in people. It resonates within both. And that's those harmony chords they talk about, in the book. And it's beautiful, Neil. I have to say, when you experience it, you know it. And if it ever stopped, then it stops, not because I want it to come or not.
All right, now I'd like to pursue this into an explanation that probably is intuitive and obvious to you, but I believe it will contribute to our webinar. My impression from what you have said today, but also my impression of what you've said in many previous webinars, that when you are talking with someone who seems to have a spiritual need, that communication, the communication that you are able to engage in, does not depend upon whether the person is Jewish or Protestant Christian or Roman Catholic Christian or Hindu or Buddhist. It depends upon the inner spiritual state of the person, and that you are not inhibited or impeded in this ability to communicate with that person. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely. And I wasn't raised to be prejudiced. I lived in the city and we grew up with every race or religion. So it would never enter my mind. Of course not.
So without wishing to hold you up as a model or an example, I would simply say that your experiences confirm the point that it is possible to raise one's own view to a spiritual level that is not limited by particular doctrines or dogmas or ceremonies or traditions, and that does not prevent you from communicating with someone whose background may be very different.
Yeah, Neil, you have to love people. Let's get down to the bottom line. You have to love people. I have learned not to find what's wrong with them, not to be critical, but to find the good in them, because I could find a million things wrong with myself. So I don't want to be a hypocrite. I'm struggling in this life to do better always. And, and again, you're humbled when you're, but the love, it has to come from love in your heart and your soul. It just is there. It's not discriminating at all in any other way.
Thank you. I would now offer the opportunity to anyone who hasn't spoken recently who may wish to contribute to this, If you wish to intervene before we go on to begin reading the excerpt, I would be happy to recognize you. Bob, please.
Just a quick thought on something that Doreen brought up to my mind here, and that was much of what Jesus in his true teachings portrayed to me was that social integration and spiritual growth are kind of inseparable. And this is a paradigm of spirituality that I think resonated with what you said, Doreen. And in this paradigm, this whole locus of spirituality is in the relationship between the personalities involved, you know, yourself and another person, you know, myself and another person, so on and so forth. I just spoke at a one of the ad hoc, you know, whenever there's a funeral, you know, they ask, you know, if you'd like to say something for the individual. And this was an individual that I had worked with for about a decade. And the first thing I thought about was, you know, what were those sorts of things that his life portrayed to me that I could describe to you know, to those other folks. And the terms I used were that loyalty, dedication to work, you know, those sorts of things were the things that I called the fruits of the spirit. Actually, I took a little bit, I put myself out on a limb a little bit with, you know, even in those sorts of things, I suppose. But I see what you've talked about here, Doreen, as the spirituality that is as you walk by, so to speak. So thanks for that. That was good. Over back to you.
Thank you. You now will be followed by Francois, who has ideas that he would like to express.
Just a short comment, because 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had experience with I was working on around the house, and 2 Jehovah Witnesses came and came to talk to me, and now they have not their Bible, they have their iPhone, and the Bible is written on it, and so they were there to explain to me that because we disobey God, everything's going wrong and everything. But I said that God that you're talking about, first of all, tell me what's your relation with? Are you a son or a servant or a slave? And both they told me we're sons. Okay, right. So you're talking about your father, and by the way, it's my father too. So we're brothers. So and I brought the discussion on that, and we talked maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and it was very cool and a very good discussion that I was happy, and they were, I'm sure. But it all depends upon, so I think just upgrade the level of discussion to the spirit and not to the fears and material things. And
I agree, and I would commend you for that experience that you've just described, because I infer from my previous experiences with Jehovah Witnesses people that the underlying scenario for them is to talk you into becoming part of their group and adopting their viewpoint. And so, in effect, their effort is aimed at domination, it is aimed at authority, it is aimed at uniformity. But what you did was, I think, a very good way of getting around that. You talk with them on the level of common shared values, being sons of the Father. And I think that is an excellent technique and an excellent example of overcoming conventional, inherited doctrines and creeds, because we all have this spiritual connection with the Father, and we interpret it in different ways, and we are entitled to interpret it in different ways. What we are not entitled to do is to impose our views on others and ask them to obey. That is the flaw in the tradition that I think humanity must set aside. Andre, you have not asked for the floor, so now I'm going to ask you to perform a service for us by reading the first paragraph of the quotation that appears at the bottom of page 3. And I would state that it is a quotation from section 6 of paper 155, namely Jesus' second discourse on religion. So the paragraph that you are going to read consists of the words of Jesus as the Midweir Commission has recorded them.
Thank you. And translated them.
Yes. Well, in the human sense, he was probably speaking Aramaic.
Right.
He could have been speaking partly in Greek, and
Yeah.
occasionally he would have spoken Hebrew in connection with ceremonies, but the common language of his day in Palestine was Aramaic.
Right. Every race of mankind has its own mental outlook upon human existence. Therefore, must the religion of the mind ever run true to these various racial viewpoints. Never can the religions of authority come to unification. Human unity and mortal brotherhood can be achieved only by and through the superendowment of the religion of the spirit. Racial minds may differ, but all mankind is indwelt by the same divine and eternal spirit. The hope of human brotherhood can only be realized when and as the divergent mind religions of authority become impregnated with and overshadowed by the unifying and ennobling religion of the spirit, the religion of personal spiritual experience.
Thank you. I would like, excuse me, to probe the implications of the second sentence. Never can the religions of authority, excuse me, never can the religions of authority come to unification. Is that sentence by itself, in effect, a rebuttal to the idea of evangelization and conversion, converting everyone else to your own viewpoint? Never can the religions of authority come to unification. Francois, does that seem to be a contradiction to you?
No, because how it is now, that's true. But Jesus didn't say you must reject the religion of authority and throw it to the garbage. It's not what he said. He said that it have to be impregnated with and overshadowed, but it have to be upgraded. But in his actual state, it's impossible because with two people that each one has got the truth and nothing else. And there's no way to achieve that as it is now.
Thank you. Bob, in effect, I'd like to interpret my own question to Francois slightly differently. This sentence that I read, that Andre read first, never can the religions of authority come to unification, seems, at least to me, an antidote to the illusion that one could call evangelization and conversion. Do you think that this sentence really is an antidote to that illusion?
Is it an antidote? Never can the religions of authority come to unification. And you're asking
what
is
I'm
that
saying by
statement-
what I'm saying by implication is that the effort to evangelize and convert implies a desire to bring people to your view, to conquer their religion by attracting them to yours.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's what we see throughout history. You know, most of the religion, I think you've maybe further on, you make a note that religion follows the point of the spear, or it follows the flag, I think is how you said it. Yeah. And what I was going to talk about in juxtaposition to that, obviously that sentence makes most sense. If we look at the history of South America, for example, religion came at the point of the spear to the indigenous natives. But it says in the next sentence by the Melchizedek, I think this is the Melchizedek, correct?
Midway Commission reporting
Sorry.
the words of Jesus.
Yes, sorry about that. Human unity and mortal brotherhood can be achieved only by and through the super endowment of the religion of the spirit. I think that's what Doreen and Francois have been talking, and you know, Andre and I have been kind of beating maybe around the technical bushes a little bit, but with the examples of the you know, the value association. I liked what Francois came up with. You know, are you a son or I can't remember the middle one, or a slave?
Not a servant or a slave.
Servant or slave. Thank you. I knew there were 3 S's there, and I'd have to play back the video to actually go get it. But thank you again. Yeah, I thought that was really good, because then we got on a I should say Francois got onto a plane of an experience, a unity experience. Is how I see it, and that's an experience of being a son, and it changed. You know, according to what you said, Francois, and you know, maybe I'll try that at some point. That changes the discussion to a more experiential level rather than an authoritative level. So I see the antidote, Neil, sorry, as the second sentence, with unity and moral brotherhood can be achieved only through the super endowment of the religion of the spirit. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out about that is that the religion of the spirit is a super endowment. Well, what the heck is that? So I did a little searching, in my note, my PDF note here says to take a look at paper 195, section 5, paragraph 8. And it's kind of a long paragraph. I won't read the whole thing, but the super endowment of the religion of the spirit, of the spirit, is explained by the Midway Commission, that says that religion is designed to find those values in the universe which call for faith, trust, and assurance. Something that Doreen gives to those folks that she meets on the street through her stories. I think religion culminates in worship. That's interesting in itself, from what I talked about the mortal mind consents to worship only, but the soul craves and initiates the worship itself. Religion discovers for the soul those supreme values which are in contrast with the relative values discovered by the mind. So what happens with these spiritual experiences, with this the super endowment of the religion of the spirit, is we experience in our soul, and we're conscious of it in our mind, this additive value that we didn't have before. And that's the reason for these experiences, and why authority is not going to achieve that, period. I wasn't going to read the whole paragraph, but the more I thought about this, it probably ought to get these last thoughts out. And then they end by saying, such superhuman insight by the mind can only be had through genuine religious experience. So I tried to unpack that religion of the spirit as a super endowment, and these super endowments can be had through the locus of our interactions with non-authoritative interactions with individuals, and it can happen at any time. Over to you.
Thank you. I would now like to, in effect, draw attention to the relationship of this paragraph with our previous discussion about mind as a channel and as an intervening reality. If we look at the details of this paragraph, please allow me to point out the words in it that connote or express mind directly. In the first line, mental outlook. Mental outlook is outlook of the mind. The second line, the religion of the mind. Then I think the fifth line, racial minds may differ. That's an interesting idea, that there is a characteristic mind pattern that is associated with different races. And then almost to the bottom, the divergent mind religions of authority. So we are talking about, in effect, a constraint of organized patterns of mind response that are dictated in the direction of authority and uniformity. And these mind patterns become the basis for a particular religion of authority. So, how does Jesus then contrast the reality of the Spirit, the super endowment of the religion of the Spirit, on the understanding that personal religious experience is still going to be interpreted through the mind? How does that overcome the mind patterns that have been developed and insisted on by virtue of authority and uniformity? Andre, I don't know whether you would call that a curveball or a fastball, but it might be interesting to hear your answer.
Well, if the batter is able to read the signs, then he might still be able to hit the ball out of the park. Now, I don't know if I'll hit it out of the park, but I think I can at least single on this one.
All right.
You bring to mind Jesus' eloquent response to this in the Urmia lectures. And let me, if I may, refer to the Midwayer's translation of this particular encounter, where Jesus says, if different religions recognize the Spirit's sovereignty of God the Father, then will all such religions remain at peace. You know what? Let me go further. Let me go above that. The brotherhood of man is founded on the fatherhood of God. The family of God is derived from the love of God. God is love. God the Father divinely loves his children, all of them. The kingdom of heaven, the divine government, is founded on the fact of divine sovereignty. God is spirit. Since God is spirit, the kingdom is spiritual. The kingdom of heaven is neither material nor merely intellectual. It is a spiritual relationship between God and man. I went back because I think these precursors are important. The religions of authority make the presumption that the religion of mind is sovereign over any supposed religion of spirit, in that only mind as it's only their thought is capable of interpreting spirit, and therefore it supersedes any kind of personal relationship. He goes on, this is really at the heart of it. If different religions recognize the Spirit's sovereignty of God the Father, then will all such religions remain at peace. Only when one religion assumes that it is in some way superior to all others, and that it possesses exclusive authority over other religions, will such a religion presume to be intolerant of other religions or dare to persecute other religious believers. Religious peace, brotherhood, can never exist unless all religions are willing to completely divest themselves of all ecclesiastical authority and fully surrender all concept of spiritual sovereignty. God alone is spirit sovereign. And finally, you cannot have equality among religions, religious liberty, without having religious wars, unless religions consent to the transfer of all religious sovereignty to some superhuman level, to God himself. Now, to me, that answers the idea of that second question, or that second line. Of course, you embellished you wanted us to take all of that into account. But, you know, in looking at that statement, that bold statement that says the religions of authority cannot come to unification. The reason is, so long as it remains a religion of authority, so long as it presumes to have authority, it cannot come to unification. If it is willing to surrender that authority and simply be a religion among other religions, then all of them can come to some kind of unification.
I think your point is extremely well taken. I would pursue it slightly by talking about the distinction between authority directed toward individual believers by the hierarchy from above, as opposed to the conflict or perceived conflict between one group of people in authority within one religion with the people in authority in another religion. So what is this authority principle that needs to be overcome, Andre? Is it simply that we need to overcome the idea that leaders of a religion exert authority toward believers? Or do we also need to overcome the illusion that one group of religionists in authority will ever overcome another group of religionists in authority?
Yeah, I think both need to be addressed. The idea, first of all, internally is what the first part of that is do I need to have authority over my flock in terms of how they think in order for them to be members of my flock? And the answer is, according to Jesus, no, because people will choose to worship together and to fellowship together on the basis of their spiritual values if you can educate them in that direction, if you can, and by that I mean if they have a spiritual education and a social education that says it is okay for me to be with people that think differently than I do, if there's some tolerance on that basis, as you know, stated eloquently both by Doreen and by Francois in the anecdotes that they shared with us. So if we're willing to do that, then we can do that. On the latter point, it is a matter of saying it is okay for people to, you know, choose another brand, so to speak. That this will not destroy my religion unless, and here would be the caveat, unless that is also a religion of authority which presumes to dominate my religion. And so where we see one religion tyrannizing over another, I believe those religions don't necessarily have to go, but they certainly need to stop tyrannizing. They need to drop their pretense at authority. And let's be sure about this. I will speak presumptuously in authority on this point, that anyone speaking from authority is presuming that they have it.
I think your point is very well taken, and the general content of your remarks certainly reinforces the quotation from the Urmia lectures that you read to us before, namely that religionists of any group must accept that only God is sovereign. No group of organized religion has the right even to proclaim authority over any other group, or for that matter, as you have also said, over its own believers as a way of dictating to them. Doreen, I think I'd like to move on, and I wonder if you could read for us the paragraph after the one that Andre read. It's still part of the quotation. It's still part of Jesus' second discourse on religion. It appears at the bottom of page A3, 89A3 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. And the paragraph begins, The religions of authority can only divide men.
Okay, thank you. The religions of authority can only divide men and set them in conscientious array against each other. The religion of the Spirit will progressively draw men together and cause them to become understandingly sympathetic with one another. The religions of authority require of men uniformity in belief, but this is impossible of realization in the present state of the world. The religion of the Spirit requires only unity of experience, uniformity of destiny, making full allowance for diversity of belief. The religion of the Spirit requires only uniformity of insight, not uniformity of viewpoint and outlook. The religion of the Spirit does not demand uniformity of intellectual views, only unity of spirit feeling. The religions of authority crystallize into lifeless creeds. The religion of the Spirit grows into the increasing joy and liberty of ennobling deeds of loving service and merciful ministration.
Thank you. Francois, there are many parallels in this paragraph in which the speaker, namely Jesus, is drawing a distinction between different ways of behaving. In the first sentence, conscientious array against each other. In the second half of it, drawing men together and causing them to become understandingly sympathetic. Do you see the idea of being opposed as an artifact of traditional religion? Do you see the idea of a common view as something that indeed draws human beings together?
Yeah, we have to surrender authority. The key word is authority. That's the problem. If can surrender at this point, there's no problem, because we'll start to understand that the other people with their own experience and culture, they think in a different way. But authority with evangelize and all those things, it's the problem. I don't know if I answer your question, but it's my point of view. So that if we see the second, the religion of the Spirit is to go over the no authority, and but we must talk about God. In my experience with the Jehovah Witnesses, it's because we agreed that we had that God was a father, that we can go over our own views. Because if they said no, we're a slave and is gonna kill us if we don't obey, but okay, the discussion is finished. We don't talk no more. But we have to go beyond the differences and find something that can create a link.
Thank you, Francois. I would say, simply for the purposes of our immediately present discussion, your story and the manner in which you told it seems to me to demonstrate the words at the end of the sentence, that first sentence, understandingly sympathetic with one another. That your conversation with the Jehovah's Witnesses made them sympathetic to you, and it showed that you were sympathetic to them. And that is because, in my opinion, you were acting out of the religion of the Spirit, not the religion of authority. Have I said anything that you disagree with, sir?
No, there was absolutely nothing of authority about. Sure.
And in fact, you were turning their craving for authority and domination over you to evoke sympathy, mutual sympathy.
But it's not really their inner desire. I'm sure about that. They've been told that, but it's not what they really deserve or want.
It's what their leaders have told them.
Hmm.
It's not really what they themselves want in their own hearts, in their own spiritual experience. And is that
Because their leaders replace their own personality by it's the religion. It's like the church. That's the authority, and not your own personality with God. That's it.
Thank you. Andre, I'd like to continue on down into that paragraph. In the second sentence of this paragraph that Doreen read, we have a contradiction, I'm sorry, a contrast. In the one instance, uniformity in belief, as opposed to the idea of the next sentence, unity of experience. How does unity of experience contrast with uniformity of belief? What are the attributes that distinguish it?
I'll dovetail right off of, again, Francois's wonderful, experience with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and with Doreen as well, and how she approached, made sure that she was not focusing on the level of mind. And she used the term, I never get political, which is wise, Doreen. And I'm sure that's not hard garnered wisdom. It's most of us see very quickly that if we attack another's beliefs, that this is a road to finding a problem. But if we can go on the common level of values, on the level of shared experiences, this is at least a doorway in with most people, because most people are looking for similar goals. Not always, but most of the time, we find that the goals are similar, even when the political methods of trying to get to those goals are different, even if creedal beliefs state that you can only get there in a certain way. And so however we can move away from particular differences in beliefs and find commonality, we're more likely to be successful. At least that's, I think, what most of us have found. And while I haven't shared any particular experiences, I resonate with the experiences that were shared. Ultimately, a good way to stop a conversation is to say, well, I don't really believe in that.
That's fine. I accept your additional thoughts as a compliment, not only a compliment, namely completion, but also a compliment in the sense of praise for the comments of others who preceded you, notably Doreen and Francois. And therefore, I will now turn to Bob, asking him to explain a succeeding sentence in the same paragraph. The religion of the Spirit requires only uniformity of insight, not uniformity of viewpoint and outlook. What is the difference between uniformity of insight and uniformity of viewpoint and outlook?
Well, frankly, Neil, that question perplexed me when I read this first time, to be honest with you. And I'll do my best. I don't know if I'm going to hit a single, even if I'll try to bunt my way on to first base here. So I highlighted uniformity of insight, and I thought to myself, okay, we're dealing with a unity of spirit feeling. So, I get that. But uniformity means that I typically have the same, it's uniform. It's the same between, a minimum of two personalities. So I looked up insight, and there are a number of broad definitions or suggestions. I think the one that comes closest is that insight suggests the depth of discernment coupled with understanding and sympathy. So it appears to me that what the Midwayer Commission, the Revelators here, are saying, that at least in the context for which we're dealing with this here, is that insight deals with those superconscious values that I think we talked about it earlier, that the mind, which the mind can experience the soul's not only connection to the thought adjuster with worship, but also the soul's ability to experience those higher super values that we don't have. For example, altruism. You know, what's after altruism? And that's why I pointed to this particular definition, or at least it's not the definition, but a suggestion that discernment, moral discernment coupled with understanding and sympathy is where we're headed here, to have a uniformity of insight. I don't have to have a viewpoint about my insight. All I have to do is explain it in general terms. And maybe sometimes insights are sublime enough that I can't explain them in words, and I have to, that's why when I think when you brought up this idea of a language, you know, do we need, you know, as our language expands, will it be able to describe these? And I think that's absolutely right, Neil. We certainly, as humanity gains these more sublime relationships through commerce and travel, etc., that our global economy and our global communication systems are allowing. I think back about Jesus when he went to Rome and he met with those I guess the 16 leaders of the Cynics and Mithraism, and I think he only provided them insights, because when Paul, you know, later came on, they connected with these insights. So it wasn't anything that he could. And also another point I want to make about that is that he did not teach in the negative. He only tried to crowd out what would be erroneous ideas, especially the Mithraic leaders, spiritual leaders, so that these insights were apparently those insights were completely uniform. So I struggle with this a bit, and you know, maybe I just hit a bunt on this one, but I thought I'd put the idea out that in fact it did intrigue me, and I did highlight it, and I had the same question that you just provided here, Neil. So thanks.
Well, Bob, thank you for offering me the opportunity to serve as an umpire and declare what you did. I think I will decline that opportunity because it's not up to me to judge the remarks of anyone. You gave a dictionary definition of insight. Let me do what I would call an etymological analysis of insight. Insight is sight in or sight into. It's using the idea of sight, seeing, to express understanding. So insight, literally, from an etymological point of view, means seeing into something more deeply. And I think if we look at the word that way, it makes it easier to understand the sentence. If we see things more deeply, perhaps we reach the level of spirit. We see more deeply into the spiritual yearnings and desires of the human being, instead of merely confining ourselves to the abstract ideas expressed in words in the outer mind. So if we see into the spirit, that will produce better results than uniformity of viewpoint or outlook expressed in abstract words. And that is at least an alternate way of looking at this. It doesn't have the authority of your dictionary citations, but it may be helpful nevertheless. Doreen, would you talk about the concluding part of this paragraph, unity of spirit, feeling the distinction between lifeless creeds and loving service and merciful ministration?
Okay. Well, I'm going to go off in a little bit of a different tangent because I've experienced the interfaith groups of all these different religions working together. And they came to realize what they said is that, yes, God is unity, but he creates diversity down here. And that's true. He said, well, they said, you have to kind of try to see the dignity in other people that are not like us, and that God is greater than any one religion and partially understood by any one faith. And they all agreed. And they said, if we have real faith, we're not threatened by other faiths. And that could be a benefit to all of them. And so they really said that dialoguing, the thing is cooperation and dialoguing with who could be against love? What do they have in common? And when I started to explore some of this, my goodness, they have more in common than not. And that's where you begin. It's not, oh yes, the goal, of course, the ideal is what's expressed, in the book. But that's not, you can't start off there. You have to start off where you're at. And they are so willing to talk about these things. And they said in Jerusalem, in the Parliament of World Religions, I went to a workshop where there was, I think, the Druze, the Muslim, the rabbi, and I believe from Christianity, Catholic. And they said they all meet together, they go to each other's functions. As a matter of fact, they said they have learned so much from the relationship about each other's religion. It doesn't subtract. And that's the whole thing. If you're so insecure that you have to hold your parish, the people that come into your parish in captivity, and to use rote and saying the prayers and all the other things they do rotely. I know I went to my grandsons who graduated from both Catholic schools, and it's the same thing. Everybody has to repeat. So, but they said they have so much in common. They all believe don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. Don't practice immorality, respect your parents, love your children, the golden rule. And this was, the Confucianism, Judaism, Christianity, unity in families and dignity of everyone was most important. And it came down to, they were really friends. And it's not every, all over the world like that, but there are a lot of movements now that are working in that direction. And they're realizing how wonderful it is that there is no separation, because it's truly spirit-led. But you have to talk to one another. You have to break the ice. You have to express, that instead of attacking each other, it's cooperating with each other and changing the way they relate to one another. So the recognition that everybody has value, and educate them to think. The differences become meaningless. You really have to also work to create projects. I mean, there's many ways that they talked about doing things together, all the different religions, and they weren't threatened, they weren't afraid, but honestly, I thought it was wonderful. And I know in one of the books that, I had quoted from, I forgot the guy's name, that we talked about when we talked about Dalai Lama, and he was kicked out of the church, as being a philosopher, professor of philosophy. He said, if there's no peace among religions, we cannot have peace in the world. So I think there is a good start. I really am much more positive about the wonderful things that, they're doing. And it's, Jesus said, love your enemies, and it's hard for people to come to that. There are other, love your neighbor, love others as yourself. But what divides us? It's really the values that we share, the the things that we have that are so wonderful that they all believe in. Who could be against joy and love and compassion, unselfishness? Who could be against that? All religions really believe it. And when I broke it down into the religions, what they said, it's truly, there's so many things they have in common. Well, recognize the commonalities. Then you could have a conversation, you could talk about it and not, not threaten each other. And that's the ego and the insecurity, mine is better than yours. It's like children. And I think they've come to a better place today. Men, I've seen this now in a few different places. And I know when 9/11 happened in my area, up in northern New Jersey, all the religious, all the different churches came to the synagogue and they all delivered something very beautiful to each other. And the rabbi said to me, because I used to meditate with him, so he said to me, Doreen, he said, we meet for lunch all the time, once a week. He says, we have wonderful conversations. So I said, can I attend? And he says, well, I'd have to ask them, because I'd love to sit in on those conversations. Anyway, that's what I have to say. And that's how I understand it. I think it's more positive than negative. I really have more faith in that the angels of nations are working. The angels of religions are working. They're all working to enhance us, to develop and further enhance the community, the brotherhood of God, the community of our existence, instead of the separation from religion and state and all this other stuff that's going on, which is very deplorable. Anyway, depressing, I meant to say. I don't like the other word. That's it.
Well, thank you. I will first express appreciation for your remarks, which are indeed inspiring, and then say that to me, a way of understanding and summarizing what you've said is the final line and a half of the paragraph: the increasing joy and liberty of ennobling deeds of loving service and merciful ministration. Because all the examples you've given, I think, fall into the framework of that statement. And I appreciate it very much. I would like to put the succeeding and indeed final paragraph of this quotation on the table. I realize we are not going to have enough time to draw on all of its ideas, but I would like to get it on the table. This is at the top of page 4 of my document, and it begins with the phrase, never forget. Now, Francois, would you be able to read this paragraph for us, please?
Yes. Never forget there is only one adventure which is more satisfying and thrilling than the attempt to discover the will of the living God. And that is the supreme experience of honestly trying to do that divine will. And fail not to remember that the will of God can be done in any earthly occupation. Some callings are not holy and others secular. All things are sacred in the lives of those who are spirit-led. That is, subordinated to truth, ennobled by love, dominated by mercy, and restrained by fairness, justice. The Spirit which my Father and I shall send into the world is not only the Spirit of truth, but also the Spirit of idealistic beauty. The Widmer Commission is a paper 155.6.
Yes. Right. Thank you, Francois. Andre, I'd like to turn to you for comment on the first sentence. Never forget that there is only one adventure which is more satisfying and thrilling than the attempt to discover the will of the living God, and that is the supreme experience of honestly trying to do that will, that divine will. Why is trying to do the divine will more satisfying and thrilling than trying to discover what the will is?
Well, it presupposes that you've already made some of that discovery, and that your sincere effort to try to do that will is, I would say, whenever that is the case, in my own personal experience, there is a real thrill. The unfortunate thing is, it doesn't seem, at least in terms of recognition, that this happens as often as I would like. It doesn't occur that I feel like I'm in the thick of doing the will of God. It only seems that that happens when an unusual experience occurs that was not, was not apparent. That wasn't that sort of came upon me. That sort of was thrust upon me, like meeting somebody coming to the door, or meeting somebody on the street. And it's not always clear what the will of God is in that circumstance. But if my fallback is, if the doing of the will of God is nothing more nor less than an exhibition of creature willingness to share the inner life with God in that bare bones but very, very important way of doing the will of God, if I can make that exhibition of my willingness to do the will of God, either in striving to worship, or striving to find some way to serve, or being willing, then there is a thrill in that, in finding that. But that's a difficult question, in the sense that experientially, I always feel like I could be doing more.
Thank you. Let me pursue this with you just briefly by distinguishing trying to do as action, as opposed to trying to discover as intellect and mind. Is that helpful to understand why trying to do is more important than trying to discover?
Well, I think in the first place, in the trying to discover an intellect, that's a first step that usually leads then to the discovery that you can't discover it in the intellect. that the real discovery is in day-to-day living. That day-to-day living, and finding how it is I can, if it's not what I'm doing, if it's simply the how of what I'm doing and doing it better, that maybe this is how I discover in some measure how to do the will of God.
Thank you. Bob, I'm going to turn to you for the last sentence that we will examine today. And that one states, "And fail not to remember that the will of God can be done in any earthly occupation." What does this say to you? How does that help us understand human life?
Well, it doesn't matter where we are, Neil. The Father has provided this, or I should say, God the Mother has the Supreme has provided all of these circumstances and vicissitudes of life for us to be able to discover, recognize, interpret, and choose. So as you asked Andre that question, this is what came to mind here. It doesn't matter where I am, that the Father's will be something that I need to discover. I need to recognize that it's the Father's will. I think that's what I got out of what you said there, Andre, was, how do I really know that in this particular situation, this is the will of the Father? Interpret it, which is what the Spirit of Truth helps us do in the current situation, what the last sentence was about. And then I have to execute. I mean, that's what I think to do means here. Once I have discovered it, recognized it, interpreted it in the current situation, it doesn't matter what the situation is, I can then choose it. Because if it's a value such as altruism or loyalty or whatever that super superhuman, superconscious value is that my mind has been able to interpret from my soul's experience, then I can certainly do the Father's will. One story comes to mind with Jesus when he was, when all the apostles, I don't know if all the apostles were there, a few of the apostles were asleep and he was awake and he was speaking with the Father. This is both in the Bible and the papers support this. And he says, Father, do I have to drink this, do I really have to drink this cup? That always impressed me, that as the human Jesus was, he certainly discovered the Father's will there. He was trying to, well, he certainly recognized it. I guess he was interpreting it in his cosmic picture at that point. So much so that, he got a little bit flustered with the fact that these men that were traveling with him for these 3 years or so, that they were asleep and didn't know what he was going to have to go through. And I guess that, we know what the ultimate choice was, is that he actually did the will of the Father, and he submitted himself to the cross for reasons of which we will probably be trying to discover ourselves for the next many, many epochs until we get to the core of finality. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up just briefly. The sentence is, and fail not to remember that the will of God can be done in any earthly occupation. So my question to you, as someone who has dabbled with computers most of your life, whether or not the computer gurus who invent new terms that are puzzling and that confuse the rest of us are nevertheless doing the will of God.
I'm sorry, could you ask that again, Neil?
It's a humorous question. The statement is that the will of God can be done in any earthly occupation. And my question pertains to the computer gurus and technicians who invent new terms and phrases that puzzle all the rest of us as to whether they are doing the will of God.
Yeah, well, thankfully, I'm not. I have left that vernacular long ago, so it's really hard for me to answer that question. But there's no doubt that there's many individuals in that profession that are doing the will of God.
Thank you. I admit to you that my question was at least partly humorous. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm ready to close, but if there is anyone who wishes to add a comment or observation before we do that, I will certainly recognize him or her. Francois, go ahead.
When I read the first sentence of that paragraph, never forget there is only one adventure which is more satisfying and thrilling than reading the owner's book of your brand new car, and it's drive that car.
Well, thank you. I understand the mindful, emotional, psychological overtones of that experience, and that is indeed quite thrilling. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had an exciting conversation today, and I look forward to the next one. Now, I have to tell you what I think most of you already know, but that our listeners do not, that the date of our next webinar is not entirely clear. For sure, we will have a webinar on Saturday, the 30th of November, which is 4 weeks from today. I have assembled a group of people who are enough to sustain a discussion of this quality. It is possible that we will be able to have a discussion on Saturday, the 23rd of November. I am not sure of that because various obligations and commitments of our participants have diminished the number of people who are available. So for purposes of your understanding, you, the viewer, we may have a meeting, we may have a webinar on November 23rd. On the other hand, we will definitely have a webinar on November 30th. So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to our next occasion.
Thank you, Neil.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Good to be with you all.
Indeed.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Bye.